It's those local communities that have co-evolved with those territories that are in the best place to safeguard all the ecosystem services that they're providing, for the rest of life.
Part of that movement building piece is going deeper into what is trust, what is power, what is removing yourself from the situation look like in the context of philanthropy.
Welcome. Today we are here with Faith Flanagan. She is the Executive Director of Regenerosity, and Ruth Andrade. She is the Chair of the Board at Regenerosity, as well as an environmental partner at Lush Cosmetics. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Matthew.
Our pleasure.
What's Regenerosity?
Oh, we always struggle to bring the full context and complexity of Regenerosity into one single tagline. But I like to say that Regenerosity, we exist to resource, connect, and cultivate grassroots organizations that are usually working across the nexus of livelihoods, climate, biodiversity, in order to support them in growing their capacities, strengthening their connectivity in their communities, and then be better able to act in their regions and bioregions as a true regenerative lighthouse.
And Regenerosity came from kind of a collaborative of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, Lush Spring Prize, and UNDP Equator Prize in an effort to catalyze the work that was already being done on the prize programs that had been shared by the two organizations that we were both in and running. So the idea was, how do we actually create a win-win situation for the grassroots organizations that were already applying for the prizes and growing their work? And also the connectivity piece is really important for the projects that we work with.
Yeah. And I think the magic is identifying the really interesting organizations that already have some track record, but with some more consistent funding, with some support in capacity strengthening, connecting them to one another. We really believe in this idea of peer-to-peer sharing. Then they can come together in a cohort and learn from each other and go through that journey of development and growth together from ways that are really attuned to what they need, to their vocation, to what the landscape requires from them. And we've been able to fund really interesting organizations working with regenerative agriculture, working with indigenous-led restoration, working to protect landscapes, mixing biodiversity and livelihoods, biodiversity-friendly enterprises. So our idea is more focused in the potential of the group to come together and grow together. So it's a kind of an accelerated program, but we prefer to call it cultivation, and also really respect that it's bottom-up, growing each other together with injection of resources, wraparound services, connectivity to other funders, support with storytelling, facilitation of their peer learning, getting them to come and meet together. It's all these wraparound services that support them to grow from within their own potential.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, you both have been in this field for some time. I think people who are, also part of the field know you and know your story a bit. But for those who don't, maybe just a brief context setting and background of how did you come into this and how did you come together?
Yeah, actually, I was with the Buckminster Fuller Institute for 6 years, and one of our colleagues and mutual friends, Daniel Christian Wall, introduced us together. And when we met Ruth, and she had the idea of actually growing the potential of the grassroots organizations that were already in our shared prize programs, it was already in our ethos and something that we had already thought about. But growing the potential of these organizations to actually learn from each other and build their stories and share their stories was really powerful to both the Buckminster Fuller Institute and to Lush. And as you said, I've been in the nonprofit world for about nearly 20 years. And so it's refreshing to see how much we push the needle in a way that I have never seen before in any of the other nonprofits that I've worked at. So,
And I have a background in environmental, corporate sustainability, even though Lush is like the least corporate company I've ever been to. But we have a long track record of funding grassroots organizations. And I've been working with them since 2004. And in about, I think it was 2009, we started experimenting with regenerative agriculture. We didn't even use that name. We just said permaculture or, improved farming practices. And we started seeing how we could evolve that work in the supply chain and did some really experimental funding, like really radical funding. And I think we could see, I got all the learnings from that. Like, what did we learn in the 15 years of funding grassroots organizations, working in really important ecosystems, and culminating in a prize program for regeneration? As Faith said, we both said, let's join. Prize programs tend to be a zero-sum game, and you get... What happens anytime there is an open application, you get a lot of interest and many hours spent writing applications from many amazing programs, and then you can fund a few. And we could see the value of that process, like going through due diligence, vetting the organizations. Right. It was there. We have like a ready-made list, ready to be funded and ready to be, to just facilitate their growth. But we're not doing anything with that. So how do we bring those prize programs together? And that's how we started. We put our vetted list with Buckminster Fuller Challenge list, with Equator Prize list, and started going out to funders. And then we developed this, what we call capacity strengthening program from that resource that was already there. So it's a really easy way to fund, to flow funds into organizations that have already gone through many steps, due diligence, all of this. They're ready. So we wanted to tap into that like unique potential. And then we came together and created something that now became its own thing. Yeah. So but it comes from this long track record.
I was just going to say the Regenerosity has been housed by the Buckminster Fuller Institute for the last 5 years, actually. And now we are a full-fledged 501c3, which is really incredible in this state of the world.
Yeah, that's great. And acknowledgements to BFI for, incubating and housing multiple terrific programs over the years.
Absolutely.
Very small but mighty organization.
100%.
And we had Stuart Cowan on the show at some point last year. Really great conversation. So that observation you just made, Ruth, of you have all these projects that have already done all this work, that have already gone through diligence and curation. Like, we don't want them to have to redo that work in another siloed grant application.
Exactly.
And we want the funders to be able to benefit from that intelligence and that diligence that's already happened. And so what are we learning about how to bring these things together, and what are the interventions and actions that you've been taking?
I think for us, it's important that's why, like in a theory of change, we talk a lot about there is the place-based impact, and then there is this layer of networking. And I think the networking amongst us, so of course, we have to do it in a way that we're both creating platform and space for voices from the grassroots to be heard directly by the funders. And that's like really important to us. And we often do that through webinars where we're actually bringing the grantees. We do this like celebrations of the programs that we invite the funders to hear directly from the grassroots organizations, like even Spring Prize, that we're really, uplifting those stories. I think that's one aspect. And just our own networking of the multiple regranters and the folks that are in maybe multiple landscapes. I think us connecting, and for Brazil, it was really interesting because we wanted to fund a very specific region. And there wasn't enough organizations within the Spring Prize, Equator Prize, like BFI ecosystem. So we went straight to the community philanthropy organizations in Brazil and thought, okay, in your last call for proposals, who were the folks that you couldn't fundraise, you couldn't find funding for, that you thought were really amazing? And we didn't really have to do an open call for proposals. We tapped into the intelligence. So I think knowing that those things are out there and then talking to each other, and again, showing the value of doing this to funders, I think is really important. That we're not wasting funders' money by really tapping into this already wealth of information that's there.
A collective intelligence.
Yeah, it's the
that already
collective
exists.
intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the
it's
field.
such a beautiful, collaborative, connective, uplifting, communal approach. And it seems like you're wrapping around a lot of support. There's a lot of incubation, there's a lot of elevation, and it's efficient, and it's like just makes logical sense. It's like a better distribution of cognition and resources and effort and time for everyone involved. And I guess, part of what we've somewhat glossed over, but I don't want to lose, and I appreciate how you brought it back there, is like, the importance of these place-based communities and these nature projects and these, indigenous-led, land stewardship, efforts. And like, maybe we can just linger there a bit more, like why this theory of change, why this, that you've built all of this organizational scaffolding and work around, and what really gets you excited and persistent for 20 years now around this effort?
I mean, I think so. Ruth kind of mentioned it. The place-based impact is really important. So working with communities in place that understand the context of the land, of the people, of the community, of the history and the culture, and really have a deep connection with the land is really deeply important to us, because only they know what they need. And so we have a lot more access, and so we are able to network and collaborate with others in the field. And so that network collaboration helps us bring in other potential funders and other potential in other ways, and collaboration and partnerships. And then we see this idea of how do we build the movement? How do we actually continue to kind of grow interest in the general population, but also in the field, towards a different way of seeing how the context actually is in place with these communities, with the leaders, but also the organizations and the communities at large. So I think part of that is, like, as Ruth said, we have a wraparound service, but even our context of how we work is all embedded in like, how do we build the movement and how do we grow capacity, not only for the communities that we're working with, but for the movement itself.
And I think when we're talking about grassroots organizations, that there is also a component of like justice and reparations in all of this. I think like the conservation movement of the 70s, led by big conservation organizations, did so much harm because it separated nature and people, right? And he thought that to protect nature, you needed to remove humans, including indigenous communities, from those areas. And there was a lot of harm done in disconnecting people from the ecosystem that they were stewarding. And now we know that actually most of the biodiversity, the figure that's often cited, that 80% of biodiversity in the world is stewarded by indigenous communities. It's those local communities that have co-evolved with those territories that are in the best place to safeguard all the ecosystem services that they're providing, for the rest of life, right? Water and carbon sequestration and, just diversity as a key strategy for resilience. So I think understanding that there's been a very extractive relationship with farming communities, with indigenous communities, how do we begin to repair those relationships while not coming from a colonized, extractive mindset of development? Or that's why we don't like using the words acceleration and things like this, because ultimately is how do we get out of the way, resource them, facilitate them to work towards more self-determination. And I think that is, that's why the how is so important. It's not just like, right, let's move money to regenerative agriculture. Let's move money to conservation biodiversity. Is the principles that are behind the how, I think, are really key at this point. So we can repair the harms done in the past.
Yeah, I was just going to say part of that movement building piece is how, like the going deeper into what is trust, what is power, what is removing yourself from the situation look like in the context of philanthropy and of even building the field so that others can actually emulate what we're doing and we emulate what others are doing. We have a lot of partnerships that have been really testing the bounds of philanthropy. And philanthropy has been this engine in the past that has been a really kind of a cog in the machine where it does become extractive. And so how do you move into a more kind of like a nature-based understanding of how to move money within the communities? And so we have been testing different forms of philanthropy over the last 6 years. And there's multiple different forms of philanthropy. There's, participatory grant making or trust-based philanthropy. We feel that I don't even love calling it this, but the more radical methods allow us to move out of the way and actually center the voices of the communities that we're working with.
And let's go there. I mean, can you help us from the top? Like, what is participatory grant making and trust-based philanthropy?
That's a very good question. I'm actually part of a participatory grant making group, and we had this question the other day at the table.
Great.
So participatory grant making is not necessarily trust-based philanthropy. And so there's a lot of methodologies out there that are used within the context of our work and the communities and partners that we're working with. Participatory grant making is really removing some of the barriers of reporting and writing proposals or building kind of like this extension before you even get into the grant. There's a lot of, we're an intermediary, so we go through this ourselves, and we're definitely, we have been in both types of philanthropy, both traditional philanthropy and participatory grant making with our funders as well.
Yeah, I think the idea of participatory grant making is that you change the seat of power from traditionally the people who hold the money and also hold the power, and you separate them and you put the power of the decision making into the hands of communities or into the hands of whatever strategy you want to have that is closer to those that will receive the money. And I think one of the coolest, most radical strategies we saw recently is Marlene Engelhorn, an heir from Austria, who wanted to distribute 25 million euros. And she didn't really think she should be the person deciding how to deploy the money. So she used a methodology of citizens assembly, random selection of people across diverse segments of society. And they came together over a few months, quite facilitated process. And if they couldn't reach a decision, she would get the money back. And then they heard from lots of different specialists, and they did a really beautiful split of what were the things that would be needed most in society. So, that is, you're also testing different ways of governance and creating more capacity for democracy. So I think that's like one of the outcomes of going towards participatory philanthropy. We're also creating more capacity in collective decision making. And I think trust-based philanthropy is also what we've promoted for quite a while. And you give unrestricted grants to organizations in trust that because they're much closer to the action, they know how to deploy that capital. And it's okay to use it for core funds. It's okay to use it for emergencies if there is one. They're trusted with resources. And you also then reduce the burden and the bureaucracy of reporting. And multi-year is the other request. So how do we give multi-year unrestricted grants with as little bureaucracy as possible? Because again, I was talking to a funder yesterday, and I'm not going to say that name, but they were saying that they only give 10% of the overall income for the organization. And they are questioning that at the moment. And I said, yes, if you're only giving 10%, it's much harder for a small organization or a big organization to steward 10 funders over, I just have to steward 3 or 4. So those are decisions that are made from a place that is not really helping organizations, because organizations should be working on the actual programs and not wasting so much money in bureaucracy, fundraising, reporting. We're extracting capacity from organizations away from what they should be doing.
And then we're complaining that they spend too much time fundraising and too much administration costs. And, it seems so obvious and just common sense. Like coming from more of a private market, my first chapter of my career,
Yeah.
like you go raise capital, like it's definitely multi-year because it's an investment for multiple years. And it's like, it's definitely trust-based because it's like, well, you're getting behind the founder and the CEO and you're investing in them. And it's like, not this, can I have $10,000 at a time, please? And
Completely.
let me give you an entire, annual report and milestone report and, go put some glossy PDFs together that you're not going to read so that you can give me another 5K. And like, it's kind of, it's a broken model. So how do we fix it? Like, obviously this is the core question that you're addressing with all of the work you're doing. But do you have a sense of what those barriers are in terms of on the funders side? How do we break down these walls around the culture, around these practices and kind of address this?
I would say there is an innate lack of trust right now in the field. And that is something that we are seeing and also need to break down. I think that, by building kind of coalitions or collaborations through, networks, but also pooled funds and collaborative funds and actually working together with other funders that actually have a deeper level of trust and have been in the field for longer is a way to actually break down the kind of mentality that we have built over time that creates that kind of cog. Because why are we trusting entrepreneurs over indigenous communities that have been in the field for forever? I mean, it's really like, it's a strange mentality that we're holding that really needs to be either shifted or broken. So I think the idea is, how do we actually collaborate better together? And how do we actually build the field together? And so part of it is like working on different strategies and methodologies that we see working in the field. One of the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years is flow funding, which is created by Marian Weber Rockefeller. And she created this methodology in the 80s around how do you actually embody trust within the leaders that you're seeing that are emblematic of doing really good work in the world, and how do you actually shift the funding so they are in the center of the decision making and they're making this decisions around the projects that they're building or the work that they're doing or even the care that they're giving themselves and their own communities. And so the idea is, how do you kind of center the trust and the power in their seat as opposed to, I'm the one that needs to have the power and you need to report to me.
And again, we keep going back because I think this is super centered to this. It's like the peer-to-peer connections and the social licensing. And I think removing the social licensing of doing an old school way of doing philanthropy, and that can only be done from wealth holder to wealth holder. And I think that peer-to-peer influence is super interesting. And what Faith said of like having more progressive funders, inviting others to join pool funds. We have a flow fund as well. That's a bit of an experiment that, funders can come and join just to have a feel for all the amazingness that and how much better it makes you feel, because what you're getting is authentic stories that you could not, like you don't know what the money is going to do. And when you hear the stories, it's usually way better than anything, you thought was possible. So I think having that embodied experience that is at a really emotional level, I think is super important. And doing that is creating all these alternative vehicles for funders to dip their toes and having wealth holder to wealth holder really influencing, I think, getting the really progressive ones to bring the others on their journey with them. I think that's really important. And what's at the root of that is fear.
Totally.
It's like there is this
risk and fear.
Risk. It's like that aversion. And we know that especially if you're coming from the private sector and investment, you learn how to really work with risk and manage your risk. And when you come to the nonprofit sector, the organizations are the ones carrying most of the burden and most of the risk, not the wealth holder. So I think really questioning that idea of risk is really important. And then just letting go. And like, you will get so much more by working with trust rather than control.
Yeah. I think too, like, so I've been thinking about this, we manage assets in an endowment and we do grant making and we're trying to go fast, but we also still have assets on the balance sheet. And I look at those assets and I mean, this is vulnerable to share, but it's just like, I'm like, okay, well, why don't I just give it all away right now?
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why
You keep
wouldn't
what
I
you
just
need.
hit the send button to,
Yeah.
and maybe it's just like distributed to a whole bunch of organizations that we know and respect and love. Or maybe it's just like, okay, these conservation easements across the Amazon
Completely.
with indigenous guardianship, like, why not just all of it right now? And when I trace it down, it's like, well, I still feel like I want to contribute in ways that doesn't reduce my role just to the money.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And I still want to build relationships with these organizations and be helpful and supportive and find leverage and like, and I want to believe that I can continue to improve the allocation impact over time, even though I'm also feeling the urgency of the moment. You know, like we can't have a lot of money sitting on the sidelines right now.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I'm curious. Like, coach me as a funder. You know, like, what do you think?
great.
I have
I
a
love
question.
that.
I think my question is, what if you separated those two things? You know, what if you could, continue in a really supportive role? Because, we also use that word for regenerosity, like a living bridge. You're bridging from this world of like neoliberal capitalism, which is a very different way of playing, into the world of transforming financial capital into living capital. And those translators and those living bridges are still really needed. So what would it take for you to separate those two roles so you can continue supporting, growing, connecting the organizations while not necessarily having assets that are causing harm, right?
Right.
And I think that's the question, like, what would that look like for you?
Right. I mean, we use the language we started with was rewilding resources.
Wonderful.
This living bridge,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
okay, the system is now calls this resources. We want to rewild that back into living capital, nature, the earth. And yeah, the way my personal response is like this, like what we're doing with Ma Earth is kind of like trying to be that accompaniment in that role and to contribute in other ways besides just the grant making.
Yeah.
And then on the grant making side, the response is we need to move quickly. Like we should not create these perpetual endowments that just sit on capital and give 5% a year.
Right.
Like we need to actually be moving size into the organizations that we support and spending down. Right? Like that's the whole idea. So that's our current philosophy and response. And we could be moving faster. Like I said, we could just hit that button right now.
Yeah.
But we're trying to take it at a pace where there's like enough trust and confidence and fear.
Yeah.
It's like fear that not that it'll go to waste, but that it won't be as impactful or as useful or as in service as what it could have been.
Right.
Right? Or that in some cases, organizations can't actually handle a deluge all at once. You have to kind of provide that multi-year support and be along the capacity building journey and so forth.
Yeah, that's very fair around. There's a lot of organizations that cannot accept that much funding at times. And so how do you prepare them to get ready for that? What was coming across my mind when you were talking about that is how do you actually create kind of a collective fund with others in your ecosystem that would help to kind of build the bridge of deploying capital at a larger scale.
Right.
And I mean, regardless of how you do it, building kind of like the confidence in the communities that you're working with to know that you're coming back year over year is a really important piece. And I think that that's the problem with a lot of funding now is that oftentimes organizations just get one tranche of funding for 1 year, which it really is a death sentence for a lot of organizations because there's no growth from there. And you give an organization $1 million and then they're like, okay, so we built this organization. We have a staff of 10 or 12 people. Where do we go from here when we can't find that million next year? And so the question is like, how do you build the field and continue to build the field? And I keep coming back to this of like, what does that look like to actually collectively build the field with, we're in a community where there's a lot of different opportunities for funding and a lot of collaboration. So how do we grow that collaboration together?
Right.
And also, how do you actually see a long-term future for the organizations that you actually see doing good work?
Right.
I think some more radical ideas. It's
Please.
like, what would it take to build a trust, like a money trust in the name of the organization, right? So
Right.
that money can still be saved and support long-term work, but the ownership of capital is moved into grassroots. I think like starting to play with what that would look like, that you're moving substantial chunks that doesn't necessarily spend altogether, because I also hear that a lot as a blockage to spending down. It's like, but I want to continue, I want to continue to be able to fund this work because we don't have a lot of funders like you that are doing this. So I think, what would it take to move trust, but stay an advisor or stay in relationship? Because I think it's like the relationship, 100%. But also moving the control and power that ultimately still lies, in your hands in this case. I think it's like, what is an experiment you can take? And I think that's experiment and prototyping super important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of the way we've thought about it is land itself.
Yeah.
Because that is it's like a capital asset that does, kind of serve that community. And so, in a couple cases, we've just essentially moved those assets to liberate the land. And then that land is owned and stewarded by that organization.
That's incredible.
And those have always felt really good, right? Like when I look back at those, it takes a lot of conviction because it's a lot of money and then it's gone from stewardship into someone else's hands. So,
but not really gone because you see the growth on the land.
Yeah.
Right. But like our ability to do as much has diminished.
Yes.
Right. So it's just kind of say the prayer and but it's felt great. Like it's truly felt great. But those were based on building relationships and building confidence and multiple years of like maybe smaller grant making that led to that and the opportunities presenting themselves and so forth. So you have to really like be in it. And I think this is what I also want to get to is you've touched on collective funding, the trust between funders, that trust to pool resources. And I have been surprised how hard it is for, like, I knew for some time that there was a lot of silos between environmental nonprofits organizations because they're competing for the same resources. And there's often a lot of duplication of work. And you're kind of like, oh, why can't you? But actually, there's a ton of silos in the funder side as well. And you hear they're legitimate, but they are somewhat feel like excuses. Well, our LP, the family office, well, we can only give away this, and then it creates all this like machinery that doesn't really lend itself well to truly pooling resources, truly co-funding as easily. And I've joined a lot of giving circles. I'd love to hear what you're learning from the one that you've organized, which I haven't been a part of, but like, what's worked in my experience is just human to human relationships, where there's like funders where I'm like, I get you, I feel you, I understand the quality of the work and where you're coming from. And so therefore, if you bring something, I'll chip in, and I know that I can come to you and point to something and then there's a strong chance you'll chip in.
Yeah.
And that's worked. Whereas what hasn't worked as much is kind of like formal programs where everyone kind of just like, says a prayer, puts the money in the middle, and then there's a committee that redistributes. Like I haven't seen that as much. But please tell me more about what you're learning in this space.
I mean,
I'm with my Lush hat.
Yes.
We're part of some pool funds.
Yes.
With Regenerosity hat, we're facilitating some. I'm part of a pool fund that is really interesting because we agree that 80% of the funds go to community philanthropy.
Right.
So it's really the community philanthropy, and that's an experiment, right? Where everyone can put money and trust that it's a very long, with a huge track record, community philanthropy in Brazil. And then they decide. And then 20%, the funders retain some decision making. So I think that's an interesting model where you are, putting 80% into more participatory grant making and into community philanthropy. And I think that works well. We have a fund now that is not necessarily a pool fund, it's one of our main programs, Blossom. But we have a really close connection with the funders, and we're trying to also get the funders to meet. So we can all jointly talk about the program and like, what is your inquiry as a funder that this program can respond? And I think what you said about like, we'll chip in and you're funding this, we'll fund together. Like imagine all the bureaucracy and the amount of money that everyone is spending, due diligence, managing grants, blah, 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 reporting, all of this that we can just eliminate, and that money can go into the grassroots. So I think, and my other experience of that is super interesting, because at Lush we run a prize that has Lush's name on it, which is like the Lush Spring Prize. We're changing the name. It's going to be called a Living Planet Prize. Cool. And we actually have 5 funders that co-fund with us. And even though it's got Lush in the name, because what I hear a lot is like, I've heard that from a really big funder, but why don't you get together? Like, you're doing exactly the same as, why do you get, said, but because we want the projects to be ours. You know, we want our name
Our
in
portfolio.
our portfolio.
Exactly.
And I'm like, that is coming from like ego, right? And even like the brand ego. And I thought for Spring Prize, it was such a cool experience that, no, it's cool. We're all for the same cause. We can see that the work is incredible. Let's all chip in so we can all fund more. And then we don't have to take the burden of doing the open applications. So I think offering that more in our spaces is super important and interesting. But I completely agree with you. It's all relationships. So even the stuff that we do is relationship.
Yeah.
It's like, then the funders come and have a direct relationship, hear the stories directly, are part of, and we like to ritualize it a bit, right?
Yeah.
So it's like creating the container for all of that to come together, because that can also be spicy. Like there have been many cases of bringing, not many, but some cases of being funders with grantees, and that can get really spicy. So how do we create a really nice curated container for relationship? Because it's all relationship.
And
It's
then
all
just,
relationship.
just to say that there's always risk in relationship.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
risks exist everywhere in relationships. So how do you build relationships of trust, not only for each other, but for the grantees? And if you can't do it with each other, it's much harder to do it with grantees.
Yeah, right.
So
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's so many themes here. I mean, like around fear, power, risk, courage. You know, I think the last one I want to just throw out there is like, I think there's, it requires an incredible amount of letting go of any attachment or kind of identity to the money itself,
completely.
and everything in culture, and people who have made money or inherited money have often like had to be so heavily identified with that. And so the idea of just like, you know, truly letting someone else decide governance over those resources, truly letting go of those resources, like that is a spiritual process, you know, that is a personal development journey that requires, and the funders who have done it, who are giving anonymously, who are spending down, who are, like they deserve so much applause, because they've gone through some sort of developmental process that is really in service to the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, how do we create more spaces for that magic to happen? And I think there are many funders circles and funders groups. Like in the UK, we have the Good Ancestors movements. We have Lynn and Honor Transition Resource Circle. I think creating those spaces for funders, even in our community of practice, we say like one meeting is about practice, the other meeting is about cultivating our own capacities with each other. So maybe asking some tricky questions, right? So we create some space to look deep inside, because if we're not, again, it's going back to the how. Even if we then decided to move all of those resources, if they're done in extractive ways that we're not cultivating trust and relationship, we're replicating the system again, right? We're just changing the form, we're changing where the money sits.
Right.
But yeah, so I do agree with you. And I think it's an exciting time, because we see that trend. There is a counter trend coming of fear again, because of the context and the politics in the US. But I think we can, we just need to know that this is the right way to move. And therefore, even if we have to slow down, or even if we need to find different ways, that the momentum is in the right direction. And I think preserving that momentum is key right now. So, yeah.
And I want to connect that up, because it's philanthropy itself is so small relative to all the capital flows.
Yes.
that
Yeah,
happen
2%.
in the economy. 2%.
Yeah, 2%.
Right? And sometimes, we're asking a lot of people to give away their money, give it away faster, give it all away, right? When arguably a lot of these basic services should be done through our collective taxation system, government
Yes.
systems,
Yes.
et cetera, right? Look, we're at the bottom of the cliff, right? So, yet in this moment, obviously, we have a huge amount of cuts happening for a lot of the communities that you serve, a lot of the
Yeah.
environmental projects we talk about on this show.
Right.
And interestingly, we're here at New York Climate Week. My sense is there's a lot of freezing up by foundations as well, so that the collective response, this is not, universally true, but it does seem like, broadly speaking, there's a little bit of a pulling back
Yeah.
at exactly the moment we shouldn't be pulling back.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's kind of open the broader topic of like, what are you seeing across philanthropy writ large? And
We're seeing that.
Yeah, but-
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, just to say that's when I'm speaking to 2%, I'm speaking to 2% is put into climate funding.
Of all philanthropy.
Of all philanthropy. And there has been a pulling back and a retraction of funding in the field. And that's happening across many of the spaces we work in many of the regions we work in, specifically in Africa. And just here at Climate Week, speaking to some of the grantees that are on the front lines, doing the work, feeling like their funding is being pulled out from underneath them, where they have had kind of like a systemic kind of change happening for up to 10 years. And now the rug is being pulled out from underneath them and they can't continue their work. So the question for me is like, how do philanthropists or how do people step up and actually start to it doesn't even need to be on the onus of just philanthropists. It could be everyday people giving more of their, a percentage of their salaries, that it could grow the movement to be a larger movement. And I think that there's a consciousness shift that needs to happen within the context of where we are today, where it's been a shift from the last decade of where we were, and politically where we are today. We have to kind of defeat the kind of like
Backward movement, or
yeah,
is that what you mean?
the antithesis of kind of where we want to be going.
Yeah.
So,
backwards.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're moving backwards. Yeah. And so how do we actually get, everyday people to actually build the bridge between philanthropy and the movement that we're trying to see today?
And I think I wanna be on record saying that I really also dislike development and USAID and all that. That has consistently disempowered, right? It's also extractive. It's also there to promote the interest of governments that are, pouring money. But it was a needed clutch, right? We removed that scaffolding, removed a clutch without replacing it with what we should be replacing, which is sovereignty and self-determination and the capacity of communities to meet their own needs, So that system was really awful, but it was holding together really important programs like gender-based violence, right? AIDS programs, HIV programs, like food.
Sovereignty programs.
Yeah. And then the response to this is, how do we also do that in a different perspective? So then it makes it even more important that philanthropy this time builds sovereignty and builds self-determination and build the resilience in the community so they're less dependent on external funding. And it's very hard if you're a displaced, population of refugees or internally displaced people. It's easier to do that through poverty alleviation, regenerative agriculture, communities that are stewarding landscapes. But how do we also think in ways that philanthropy at this point should be building sovereignty and self-determination? And I think the last thing I want to say about this is, you mentioned to that, the philanthropy is such a small part of the funds. Like the big money is investment, is, the private sector. And all philanthropy, as you also mentioned, has endowments and assets and donor-advised funds. And I think within the stack of capital, that's the easier capital to move.
Yes.
So I also feel it's us as a field, it's our responsibility to start the Rewild investment funds and the regenerative agriculture investment funds to support the move of philanthropic funds in ways that are building social, ecological entrepreneurship in the communities that, are used to receiving aid. So I think that shift is important. I think it was terribly done, but I think it creates an opportunity for us to try to do it right.
Yeah.
But that's a position of privilege because millions of people are also going to die because of the cuts. Yeah.
I'd love to talk about the endowments because I agree with that thesis. Like as we move up the capital stack from the grant making, those same institutions stewarding assets and traditional stock and bond portfolios is probably going to be easier to move than some of the incentive structures of some of the other forms of capital.
Wow, pension funds.
We're in such a good position in the philanthropic community to be having those conversations, to be bringing these two often siloed within the same organization. I've talked to big foundations and it's like complete separation. These folks over here do the grant making. These folks over here just optimize for a return. They don't talk to one another, even though their money is often in conflict. And you're like, what is going on? Exactly. You're the same organization. But one question I have for you specifically is when we have looked and continue to look, and we have an active inquiry around like more socially impactful, nature-based investments. A lot of it's predicated on different forms of climate finance or
renewable energy,
or patterns that to me don't feel like they're supporting the self-sovereignty of these communities or not necessarily creating the right experience and incentive structures of how the capital is either loaned or distributed and invested. And so, maybe from the vantage point of the experience of the communities you serve, what types of social enterprise, investment opportunities exist that you think are good where foundations can start to deploy more of their endowments?
Yeah. I think like with my Lush hat and all the work we've done in the supply chains, I think we've invested, we were able to switch a lot of our raw materials to perennial crops, right? So non-timber forest products. And they will traditionally come from communities that are actually wild harvesting, so many wild harvested materials. And then you need to build capacity in cooperatives. And what we find is that they lack the capacity to export, to manage, how much what the yields can be like. But then now there is a partner in Brazil that I just met here at Climate Week that is doing really amazing satellite mapping with AI to estimate what the crop yields of wildly harvested ingredients could be and have more security of supply. So I think like building that capacity in the value chain for materials that are, harvested or grown in ways that are supporting the environment and increasing actually ecosystem services and all of that. I think that's one. Like in Brazil, there was a Citaui, they're called. It's like a financial institution, and they just did an oversubscribed investment program with 12% returns, huge, for supporting the bioeconomy, community cooperatives that were harvesting and selling products connected to the bioeconomy in Brazil. Like regenerative agriculture, there is a huge potential.
Exactly.
And then, if you have a big funder that has the impact investment and the grant making, then they decide to talk to each other. Use philanthropy to de-risk, transition to regenerative agriculture. I think like the coolest project, I cite this project, maybe I saw it already like 10 years ago. It was in Thailand, and they got grant money to really pay farmers to transition to agroforestry for 5 years. So guaranteed cash payments from GM corn on hills, right? It's the worst thing for the environment. You're just like taking all your topsoil away. And a transition into agroforestry systems with a contract with a supermarket. So they would already buy. So they did really well-planned agroforestry. And of course, the payment would fall over the 5 years. So it started high and then it would go down. And then philanthropy unlocks that, and then you don't need philanthropy anymore because then they have a robust business that's even more resilient to climate because it's not just monoculture corn, it's now mango and squash and, sugarcane and coffee and cocoa and all of that.
I would say also with the mushroom production for the work that we're doing at Regenerosity, we work with a couple different organizations that are working on growing mushroom spores and producing that, so that it creates a value addition for food security. And right now they're growing the spores in refugee camps, which is a very low yield of food in these camps. So it's a highest yield of protein that you can get. And then also there's this market addition that you can have where they're selling a percentage of the mushrooms to the market to grow, potential more opportunities for themselves, but also, feed their neighbors and then train their neighbors in regenerative agriculture. And so it's a beautiful value addition for one particular or two particular organizations that we're seeing, but it is a high yield production for these organizations.
And we're planning now that kind of cultivation 2-year program with organizations growing mushrooms across refugee settlements in East Africa. Because again, mushroom grows so quickly and it's just amazing. But the limit is clean spawn and having clean labs. So that could be like the beginning of it can be philanthropic money, but the growth of those projects can be loans, recoverable grants.
Completely.
Right.
There's so many different types. I think the funders we're talking to, within that capital stack, they're looking into just pure returns. So they just get the grants back. Some are looking at returns minus 10% or 15%.
Right.
Others are looking at patient capital with very little returns. And then maybe some of their portfolio is in renewable energy where they're getting high returns. So I think the more knowledge we can share and create the pipeline also, which is totally not our what we do at Regenerosity. But I think the more we can do that, the more we'll experiment with this rapid deployment of funds into living systems. Basically.
And I think there's a gap in that. Like, I wish Regenerosity did that because when we first started our philanthropic journey, we just signed up for a DAF and put some money in a DAF. And but the DAFs, by and large, they don't have these more sophisticated capital structure opportunities.
Right.
Once you get to certain sizes and deeper relationships, you can make boutique investments and groups like Impact Assets and so forth, like kind of specialize in this. But it still requires a fair degree of sophisticated financial knowledge operating in a system where this is not business as usual. So you have to have some real capacity building in that finance stack. And there's so many silos, So I guess, one final question on that topic is just any other thoughts about how do we break down these walls and make sure that endowments and foundations can kind of start to bring these things more holistically together.
I was thinking the other day, because some of the funders we have spoken with in the past, like the family office is the block, right? It's the accountants and the financial advisors.
Totally.
They are the block and the people managing the DAFs. And I wonder, I imagine that are already many family offices and that are already philanthropic advisors and already financial advisors and DAFs that have maybe started looking at things in a different way. I think even mapping that would be a really interesting exercise. And then gifting it to even our network of more enlightened funders, right? This is what we found that is already out there. We also were talking to a funder. They're doing a 20 million investment portfolio on rewilding. And I spoke with them and said, right, once this is done, just like take it to your friends and say, do you want to put another 20 million here? I think we need a bit of mapping and a bit of a role, like this interstitial, role that is helping to form those connections. It's super interesting.
Helpful. I know you've got to go, Ruth. I hear you have a media engagement that supersedes our channel, might be CNN. But other questions or topics you want to get across, other key messages or points? And just to say, like, I really just appreciate your persistence in the field, appreciate the energy, Obviously, these are difficult moments and times that we're in right now. And just like, thank you for continuing to fight the good fight. But please, any other closing comments and words you want to share?
I mean, just to say that we didn't speak much about our programs, and our programs are growing and building kind of the capacity, like grassroots organizations in the field. And right now we're seeing a gap in the work we're doing in East Africa specifically. And so any ways that we can build the field for the communities that we're working with in East Africa would be incredibly helpful.
Great.
Exactly. Yeah. A clear request
Yeah.
for funds, especially for East Africa.
Yeah.
And the Mushroom Consortia or the things that we talked about today. I think for me as well, it's money. Even though it's not clear, but our economy, it relies 100% on nature. And without a stable working nature, money is not worth anything. It's completely tethered to the ecology because we are in a finite planet.
Yeah.
And to have that basic understanding that unless your money is being used to sustain the ecology and the capacity of holding life on this planet, you're making a bad investment. It's really clear. It's not long-term. It's super risky. The biggest risk at the moment is climate change, right? So I think having that meme and spread, I think is really important. How tied money is to a living, functioning nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you both. Okay, to learn more, just go to regenerosity.world, where you can find the programs that have been mentioned here, including the East Africa funding needs that Faith mentioned. We'll have links in the show notes as well to some of the other organizations, projects, and efforts that have been discussed in this episode. Shout out to a conversation I just recently had with Brandon Welch from Mad Capital. If you want to go deeper into that topic of lending around regen ag and organic farming, and how foundations can put money to work in that way. I think that was a particularly good deep dive into this topic as well. And for more of our conversations and episodes, of course, just go to maearth.com. Thanks for being on the journey with us, and we'll see you next time.